This webinar is going to cover the control of respiration, primarily discussing the role of the nervous system in controlling breathing. But before we look at the nervous control of breathing, let's look at what goes on locally within the lungs in regards to blood flow and ventilation. Lung perfusion is really blood flow. And what happens in the lungs is that if the alveoli are not being properly ventilated, they don't have enough airflow going in and out, is if the oxygen levels get too low, it's in the cutoff is if it's less than 70 millimeters of mercury. That's within the alveoli. The blood vessels serving that part of the lungs are going to constrict, and they refer to as pulmonary hypoxic vasoconstriction. Now, it's an adaptation in that what it wants to do is we want to make sure that poorly ventilated alveoli, that blood is not being directed to that, but rather to better ventilated alveoli. Otherwise, the blood that's going through that area is going to end up leaving with very low oxygen and higher carbon dioxide. So we're just going to shunt the blood to a better ventilated area in the lungs. Another thing that we'll see locally is the effects of carbon dioxide on alveolar ventilation. Carbon dioxide, like we had talked about with vascular smooth muscle, has similar effects on bronchial smooth muscle. It is a potent dilator. So it relaxes the smooth muscle in the bronchioles. And what it will do, if it relaxes, that improves airflow. And what this would be doing is kind of working together with that pulmonary hypoxic vasoconstriction, is that we want to direct blood to better ventilated areas in the lungs, and we want to make sure that airflow is really good in those better areas of the lungs. So we're going to relax that smooth muscle and improve airflow. And this could be a partial compensation for if you have some, say, damaged pulmonary lobules, where then you're going to have higher carbon dioxide levels. So it's going to allow it to improve that airflow to more functional alveoli. Now, the next thing we want to do is really look at how the nervous system controls breathing. And most of you, you think about it, you don't really think about breathing unless I tell you, if I start talking to you about it, that you're going to start changing your breathing pattern. But most of the time, you really don't really think about breathing. So I'm going to tell you a little story. And it's an old folk tale, and they've made it into some books and in some other things. You can look it up and you can find different variations on this. But there's this thing called ONDINE'S curse. It was a story about a water nymph named Ondine, and water nymphs are immortal. Well, she was very beautiful, and she fell in love with a mortal, and this mortal man fell in love with her because she was so beautiful. Well, when they got married, he had said to her, quote, my every waking breath shall be my pledge of love and faithfulness to you. So that's what his pledge was. Like, I'm going to be with you forever. I'm going to always be faithful. Well, after she gave birth to their son, she started to age, because when she married him, she lost her immortality. So she began to age. And as she began to age, her beauty changed somewhat. And so her husband his eyes started to wander. And one day, Ondine found him in an uncompromisable position, or that he was being unfaithful to her. She became very angry, and she reminded him of what he had said to her when they got married. So she told him, for as long as he was awake, he will breathe. But if he fell asleep, his breath would desert him. So as long as he was awake, he would have to think about breathing. But once he fell asleep, you don't really think about breathing. He was going to die. So really what it's touching on is the role of your central nervous system in the regulation of breathing. We really don't have, like when you go to sleep, you're not thinking about breathing. Your nervous system is controlling it while you're sleeping, but it's also controlling it while you're awake. But there is a condition that is, I think it's called central hypoventilation syndrome, where it's kind of, they used to call it Ondine's curse. But with these people, is they have very severe sleep apnea. So when they go to sleep, they don't have that regulation of respiration like you should, but they're okay while they're awake for the most part. So let's look at the nervous control of respiration. So the regulation of respiration is a great example of reflexes again. You'll have variables such as stretch, irritants, changes in hydrogen levels, oxygen, CO2. Well, we have sensory receptors, or sensors that you see here. So we have sensors that pick up those changes. Well, the information is going to be carried to an integration center. Here we call it a central controller. And it's going to be carried via nerves. And pretty much it's cranial nerves 9 and cranial nerve 10, glossopharyngeal and your vagus nerves, send the information up to these integration centers. And primarily we're going to look at, it's going to be a very important one, will be in the medulla oblongata. But we do have some other areas in the brain that somehow are going to influence respiration. And then in response to whatever the change was, the integration center is then going to control our various effectors, which are going to be our respiratory muscles. So the nerves that control the respiratory muscles will be like your phrenic nerve for the diaphragm, your intercostal nerves, and so other nerves that control some of the muscles involved in breathing. Now, the primarily regulation of respiration is autonomic control via the pons and the medulla oblongata, but we do have some voluntary control of breathing, because I could ask you hold your breath or purposely hyperventilate. You can do that, but to a certain level. You can only hyperventilate to a certain state before your fingers get all tingly and your toes start to feel really weird, and you can only hold your breath for so long. So let's look at the different respiratory centers. First one I want to look at are rhythmicity centers. The two that are part of the rhythmicity centers is the dorsal respiratory group of neurons and the ventral respiratory group of neurons. These are found within the medulla oblongata. The reason why they call it dorsal versus ventral is just where they're located. The dorsal respiratory group of neurons is on the dorsal aspect of the medulla oblongata, and the ventral respiratory group is on the ventral aspect. Now, the dorsal respiratory group of neurons is our primary, think of it as the pacemaker for breathing. This one sets your basic rate and rhythm of breathing, and the neurons in there have kind of like a pacemaker potential to it. And what you'll see kind of here is there's going to be a lot of input coming in. We got stretch receptors, we have different chemoreceptors, we have pain receptors, proprioceptors, high brain centers can somehow send information down. So in that dorsal respiratory group of neurons, that is going to receive these information, and your basic rate and rhythm of breathing can be influenced by various things that are happening in the environment. So they receive sensory input from a number of different places. Now, predominantly where the dorsal respiratory group of neurons is going to be influencing is your diaphragm, which is your major muscle of breathing, but also your external intercostals, which are involved in inspiration. Now, the ventral respiratory group of neurons is what you see kind of like right here, is more involved in forced breathing. This is an important thing to understand or to write down, is this is the group of neurons that innervates accessory muscles of breathing. So if you do forced breathing, you're going to need accessory muscles. So if I asked you to take as much air in your lungs as you can, you're going to need some accessory muscles to expand that rib cage even more. So things like your scalenes, I'm going to just abbreviate, sternocleidomastoid is SCM. They would help with increasing inspiration and exhalation. The internal intercostals would be involved in forced exhalation, internal. And your abdominal muscles would help with, say, get as much air out of your lungs as you can. So these are going to be important when you say, like I had said, take as much air in your lungs as you can, or say hold your breath. And a lot of you guys, I say hold your breath, you're going to take a big breath in. This also be important, say, during exercise when you do much more forceful breathing. Now, the dorsal respiratory group of neurons is important in your more basic rate and rhythm of breathing. The ventral respiratory group of neurons is only really involved in force type breathing. Both of them are located in the medulla oblongata, and they're collectively referred to as rhythmicity centers. And the input from them is from the various receptors is coming in via cranial nerves 9 and 10. Glossopharyngeal is 9, vagus is 10. Now the pneumotaxic center, which you see here, is in the pons. Some would actually refer to it as the pontine center. This one can alter the rhythmicity centers in response to input from, say, higher brain centers, like you see here, the cerebral cortex or the limbic system or the hypothalamus. Limbic system, think of memories and emotions, and hypothalamus is also involved in like fight or flight and rage and things like that. Is the pneumotaxic center can alter the frequency of action potentials coming from the rhythmicity center, which can increase your breathing rate or decrease your breathing rate, and affect your depth of respiration. Now, it does have here something called the apneustic center, but I purposely do not write it in the notes because the apneustic center has never been identified in humans, like an actual location of an apneustic center. It's been identified in some animals, but not in humans. But it's considered to somehow adjust the output of the respiratory rhythmicity centers too. There's such a thing as apneustic breathing. So if you're interested in what apneustic breathing is, if by looking at that and you look it up, then you could figure out what they think that the apneustic center does. But I'm not going to go into it because, again, it has never been identified in humans, so I don't put a lot of emphasis on it. Now, the reflexes that I want to talk about, and we're just going to kind of review them real quick and then we'll go through each one of them, is the different sensory input going to those rhythmicity centers could be coming from chemoreceptors, either located within the medulla oblongata, those are central, or peripheral chemoreceptors, which are located in the carotid bodies in the aortic arch. They're sensing changes in either oxygen or carbon dioxide or hydrogen levels, and we'll distinguish between them. And this one, there's a mistake on this. I'm going to put a big X by this, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to put a big X by that. You also have stretch reflexes that we'll talk about. We have stretch receptors in lungs. You have receptors in lungs that detect irritants, like if you pepper spray yourself. You have emotions and pain and temperature that can also affect breathing. So what I want to do first is look at the central chemoreceptors. Now, the central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla oblongata in a separate region from the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, but it has input to that dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Now, what these guys are sensitive to is elevated levels of, or I should say, what they respond to is whenever your carbon dioxide levels in your bloodstream go up, we're going to show you what happens, which kind of sets those central chemoreceptors out, off. So you'll notice you see this H kind of going down and coming back up. Well, hydrogen ions in your blood should not cross the blood-brain barrier because they're very polar. But carbon dioxide, being a gas, can cross the blood-brain barrier very well. And what happens within the cerebral spinal fluid is you see this reaction, which you've seen before. This occurs. And the carbon dioxide combines with water that's found in that cerebral spinal fluid and forms carbonic acid. And that Ca is that carbonic anhydrase that catalyzes that reaction. Well, the carbonic acid will dissociate into hydrogen ions in bicarb. Well, it's these hydrogen ions that are formed within the cerebral spinal fluid that bind to these central chemoreceptors. So it's hydrogen ions within the cerebral spinal fluid that set off the central chemoreceptors, but the where they originated from was ultimately from elevated carbon dioxide levels in your plasma. Well, what's going to happen is the central chemoreceptors will then send information to that dorsal respiratory group of neurons, and which will affect your breathing. So you'll affect, say, the activity of the phrenic nerve. So your respiration rate will go up. So if carbon dioxide levels go up in your bloodstream, the ultimate response would be an increase in ventilation, and this is mediated via the central chemoreceptors. So again, I have to emphasize, the central chemoreceptors will be involved if you have elevated carbon dioxide levels in your blood. Elevated hydrogen ions within your blood do not, or are not going to influence the central chemoreceptors. Okay, so it's the hydrogen ions that are formed within the cerebral spinal fluid as a result of the reaction of carbon dioxide with water. Now, the peripheral chemoreceptors, we have them in the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. Now, these are different than the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Those were baroreceptors. These are different receptors. These chemoreceptors, and there will be a slight difference with them, is aortic bodies are sensitive to carbon dioxide and oxygen levels in your plasma. The carotid bodies are responsive to CO2, oxygen, and hydrogen ions. Okay, I'm going to put a little star here. So elevated hydrogen ions in your bloodstream, say if you have metabolic acidosis, is the increase in respiration as a result of that condition is mediated through the carotid bodies. And what happens is both the aortic bodies and carotid bodies their input goes up to the medulla oblongata. There's just a slight difference. The aortic bodies, the information's going up just through the vagus nerve. The carotid bodies is sent up via the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, so just a little difference with which cranial nerve is used to send the information. Now, what happens is the carbon dioxide levels, if they're elevated in your bloodstream, will increase ventilation mediated through the peripheral chemoreceptors, just like you saw with the central. There's a little bit of difference, is if CO2 levels go up, those peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies, their response is a little bit quicker than what you see with the central chemoreceptors, because the central chemoreceptors, you have to wait for CO2 to go into the cerebral spinal fluid for that reaction to take place in order for something to happen. Here it's just a little bit quicker, but it's not as significant. The change in respiration, the ventilation, the depth, and the rate is going to be much greater with the central chemoreceptors than the peripheral. But one thing you'll notice, there's a huge difference though, there's a couple other differences, is oxygen. Central chemoreceptors are not sensitive to low levels of oxygen, but in your peripheral chemoreceptors, if your oxygen levels drop below 60 millimeters of mercury, so it's got to be pretty low in order to ultimately increase ventilation. So one thing I have to kind of remind you, and I'll say it over and over again, is the primary stimulus for breathing or regulation of breathing is carbon dioxide levels. It's not oxygen. Oxygen has to get really, really low in order for you to start to change your ventilation in response to it. But those peripheral chemoreceptors will detect the low levels of oxygen. The other difference is hydrogen ions. Now you see here, they showed you kind of that reaction again here. Hydrogen ions, if this reaction is taking place in your blood, the hydrogen ions that are being produced as a result of the CO2 combining with the water and forming carbonic acid and the hydrogen ions and bicarb, is the hydrogen ions will stimulate and adjust carotid bodies. So an increase in hydrogen ions will be detected by the carotid bodies. That will increase ventilation. But that hydrogen ions also could be produced, say, from if you've got lactic acidosis, or you have a lot of ketone bodies, which are weak acids. So any hydrogen ions, high levels of hydrogen ions within your blood will stimulate respiration, and it's mediated through the peripheral chemoreceptors, specifically the carotid bodies. The aortic bodies only respond to oxygen and CO2 levels. They're more, think of them, they'll be more cardiovascular. They're closer to the heart. The the carotids are more affect with respiration. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is just briefly some of these other reflexes. Is you have, say, stretch receptors in the lungs that if the lung volumes get really either too high or too low, it'll affect breathing. So if I try to overinflate my lungs, you overstretch the lungs, you can damage it because the alveoli are very delicate. And so what's going to happen is it's going to send the information up to the medulla oblongata, and what's going to happen is she's like, nope, no more firing. I don't want to breathe in anymore because I could overinflate my lungs. And so the stretch receptors also responds to if you're trying to do forced exhalation. It's only so far that you can force the air out of your lungs. So those stretch receptors really are not active under normal conditions. You've got to be at the larger lung volume, say during exercise, or if I'm asking you to do a lot more forceful breathing. We do have we have the irritant receptors that respond to, say, certain chemicals you breathe in, like I said, like capsaicin. If you breathe them in, we could damage the delicate tissues, so what it'll do is it stops you breathing, and it's a very strong reflex, and actually that reflex is mediated via the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system will cause the bronchial smooth muscle to contract. So it's trying to prevent damage to the airways. Other things that can affect breathing is pain, temperature can do it. So you think about someone gets really upset, their breathing changes. If you jump into some ice cold water, you notice like you do that, you stop breathing. So really ice cold can cause a very temporary decrease or stopping of breathing, which is apnea. So apnea is where you're not breathing at all. You can have fever, high temperature, increase in temperature actually increases respiration. And I just noticed that the other day is I had to do a lot of moving of stuff from my shed to my garage, and so I had to keep going back in front of the house, and it was really, really hot out, and I was getting really hot. And I went inside, and I was breathing heavy for a long period of time after I came in the house. And I'm like, granted, I'm out of shape, but it wasn't that. It's like I would have stopped breathing that much like that, but it was the heat, and my face was red for the very longest time. So temperature can affect respiration. Also, emotions can affect respiration. And again, like you said, this isn't a reflex, but you have voluntary control over your breathing too. So this will be the end of the lecture on control of breathing.